So, Apocalypse Now, the Redux version, right? Directed by the Francis Ford Coppola. Like I told you guys the other day, Francis Ford Coppola is most known for the Godfather trilogy. He did all three movies in the Godfather trilogy. Godfather 1 and 2 are among the most famous movies of cinema. Reason why I don't do any of them is you can't really watch one without doing two as well. All right, so that's why I don't teach it. But three is just not very good. All right, but he's most known for that. Any of y'all seen the Godfather films before? Bill, you've seen them?
All of them.
All of it. You agree with my assessment that
yes, certainly it was 1 and 2. You couldn't wait to see 3, but it wasn't up to par.
They actually just came out with a new edition of 3. He kind of like added stuff in that was deleted, kind of like with Apocalypse Now. So I'm gonna have to give that a shot. He's known for a lot of stuff. The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, both those are his most well-known films. He's done a ton of other stuff too. He's one of our most well-renowned, most well-respected directors who are still living today. This movie is interesting because this movie is interesting in talking about from the money side of Hollywood. That's something we haven't really talked a lot about. The money side of Hollywood. He didn't really get a lot of support from the studios to actually do this movie. So this movie is really one of our first independent type films that we have in this class. He got funding from like rich benefactors who gave him money for it. This was almost like the first GoFundMe type of movie, right? He poured a lot of his own fortune into making this movie that he had earned when doing the Godfather movies. So he even spent a lot of his own money to make this. So this is a case where art, right? This was his passion project, right? This is what he poured a lot of himself into this. Even even as far as mentally, like the guy made a movie about descending into madness, and he kind of like had a mental breakdown even after he made the movie, right? So he poured that much of his soul into it, I suppose you could say. So,
do we know if Jane Fonda was one of the contributors to the movie?
I don't know. That would be
It's
interesting.
a good point.
Yeah, we know that Jane was not a fan of Vietnam, right? So she's she's among the famous protesters. She later married Ted Turner, right? Who was a big, who, as we know, did the Turner Classics channel. So they divorced, but they were married a while. Just a fun fact. So yeah, movie's made in '79. So we're removed from the war by a few years. Right, the war mostly wrapped up around 74, 75. That's when Nixon pulled the troops out finally, right? So yeah, that's a bit of that. We have some well-known actors in the movie. We got Martin Sheen, Charlie Sheen's dad, plays Willard. We got the great Marlon Brando playing Colonel Kurtz, and as well as Robert Duvall, who plays Colonel Kilgore, the kind of crazy colonel here. All right, so yeah, I was reading through your guys' discussion responses, and this was going to be a good time to talk about the economics of Hollywood. Right, a lot of you guys were focused in on that Redux version and all the deleted scenes that were added back in. A lot of you guys thought that made the movie fattier. Right. Now it would be interesting for you to go back and watch the '79 version without those scenes now, and think about like how the movie's different because of it. Hold on a second. The sounds of Beckley, sirens are always going off, right? So, yeah. Had anyone seen this movie before? Before this, you had not, Bill. Yeah, so very probably the most famous Vietnam film. There's another one that's, of course, you got two other famous ones. You got Platoon, as well as Full Metal Jacket, directed by Stanley Kubrick, which is another famous one. But we can even make the case it doesn't matter where they set this movie, right? The themes would still be the same. This movie comes from a book called Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, very famous British novel. Kurt's novel actually works in Africa, right? He sets up his base in Africa when the British try to colonize Africa. So we have this kind of colonization theme in both texts, the British in Africa, the Americans and French in Vietnam. So yeah, that's my lead in to the film. What was your guys' reactions? What's your hot takes to some of these
Okay,
scenes?
I'll go ahead and start since nobody's going to talk.
Go ahead.
But I was big on the editing. Like I believe that it less is more. And I'm all about a movie being 3 hours long if that's what it needs to cover the story and the detail. But I found myself sitting here watching it and my mind drifting off thinking about what I needed to do or something instead of staying focused in on the movie because it was like the same thing and drawn out opposed to, like in the Titanic, your mind's it's going everywhere. So you have all of these things going on and all these different scenes. Um, but this just seemed a little drawn out. I liked the storyline. I loved the actors. It was nice seeing Harrison Ford in there too as a young man. Um, just all of it, I believe, was great. Except I believe it was a little too lengthy. I believe that there was some things that could have been taken out of there and maybe kept your interest more into or my interest more into the story, as well as um, been a little more dramatic for the story instead of, your mind kind of drifts to this or that's going on, opposed to worrying about what's really going on in the story.
Here's a question I pose to you, Crystal. Is that the point though? Right? Is that the point that your mind it's so long and drawn out that your mind kind of drifts, right? You're kind of going along with the ride with these guys whose minds are drifting, right?
Hmm.
I I pose that to you. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, it could be because I mean, whenever you get to the end where you finally, they've reached their destination, and I mean, even to the point where the people put their um, swords and guns down because they're going to follow him. I'm kind of wondering the whole time, is he going to just stay and be king, or is he going to leave? And then you see that they've just flattened him. But I believe that for me, it would have been a lot more climactic if they wouldn't have kind of drug it out. But I see your standpoint as well, that it could have been kind of getting you to feel that character and what they're going through, their journey.
Yeah, this version is 30 minutes longer than the original theatrical cut. Just so you guys know, I pointed out the scenes that were added on the discussion board. The
Hmm.
French scene, the Playboy Bunny scene, the scene with where Kurtz reads from Time magazine. That wasn't in the original. So those are a few that were added in. Also, there was more surfing with Colonel Kilgore. There was more of that added to the Redux as well. I forgot to mention that. So yeah, building off what Crystal has said, what was some of the rest of you guys' hot takes on Kirsten? I want to call on you. You seem like you agreed with Crystal when I read your discussion board post. You want to elaborate? on what you said about the length of the movie and how it seemed kind of fatty and all that?
I just felt like it was kind of drawn out
Yeah.
over anything else. I felt like some of the scenes they didn't need, and when they did the Flight of the Valkyrie song, I was kind of expecting more from that scene than what appeared. So I guess that's my point of view. Was I kind of felt the same way as Crystal did about the movie.
What did you expect with the Ride of the Valkyries scene?
I guess I just expected a little bit more action, like you would have seen from other movies that have used that song. Um, like I think there's one Marvel movie that they've used it. There's a few other movies, especially the war movies, that they've used that one. It's a lot more, I feel like, action during that scene when they use it.
Right. Well, in the scene in this, they're mowing down innocent people, right? When they're playing it, right? So it's the action, the action's there, I suppose, but it's not reciprocated, right? It's not two different armies battling each other. It's literally just these helicopters mowing down this village, right? So yeah, interesting points.
I agree that it you have like I know that like the helicopter scene and uh the whole Valkyries and all that. Like I knew that was a iconic scene, and I'm surprised. Like all of the scenes, and that was the one that's like really that intense. Like they went through the jungle, they went through the bridge and all that, and that's the one that everybody sees as iconic. Like
Right.
that entire journey, and you're going to focus on the first 20 minutes of it.
Yeah, that's an iconic scene in part because of that speech that Kilgore gives. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory. Right. That's that's I don't know if you guys have seen that scene somewhere before in your past. I'm sure you've encountered it or had it mentioned at some point.
I've heard the phrase, but I've never seen the scene until I've watched the movie.
Yeah, that's his performance. He's in the movie like 10 minutes, and like he leaves his mark on this movie. Like, one question we'll talk about today is who's the bigger monster, right? Is it Kurtz or is it this guy? Right, both of them seem to be monsters in their own right. But what do some of the rest of you guys think? One of you, Corey, I know you just talked. I know you mentioned you liked the French scenes that were added to the movie.
Yeah, I was trying to even rewatch it because I wanted to get everything because it felt like just a lot of just arguing and being it's in French. I don't speak French. It's hard for me to understand everything. But I think it's just interesting the fact that they put in that scene to kind of show that there is still that mark of imperialism in Vietnam. And my general understanding was that that just kind of ended like right after World War II, and it's still going on. And they mentioned the fact that Roosevelt didn't like the French being in Indochina, and then they left, and then Indochina becomes Vietnam, and then they just talk about how communism rose and stuff like that. It was I didn't understand all of it. I probably have to watch this thing like 5 times for me to understand everything, but it struck me as something worth noting.
Right, it gave some context for the long history of violence that was pervading the area. Right. That's why that scene is why I prefer the Redux version. Like without that scene, I think the movie loses something important.
Well, without that scene, we don't realize that the French, they've been there for years, long before we got there. They fought a war, well, what a war, even. I don't think we ever were, I don't think that was ever considered a war. I believe it was a conflict, and I tried in my paper not to use the word war, because I know that was one of the things. It was a conflict that the several nations that had went in there could not win. And yet here we go in and we think we're going to do something that no one else could do. And we did go in there. And of course, it was I remember those days, by the way. I was a junior, senior in high school when I got my draft notice. And then a little bit after that, they cut the draft off. So that was a real freedom time for me, because throughout the years of being in high school, from a freshman up to my senior year, I pondered on that, going to Vietnam, and had friends that were that lost their lives there. One of my very, very best friends was blown up there and lost a leg and a hand, and so you can go on. And also, something I'd like to tell the class is, after my friend had been out of Vietnam for 30 years or so, he wrote his own memoirs, and they were personal, and he only let 5 people read them, including his wife and his son, my brother, and myself. And I'm telling you, they were, you as I watched this movie, it was kind of hard for me. It was hard for me to watch, because as they were going up the river, this aura of all those things I read in that memoir started to become real to me. It was very personal to me, because I could have been there. I could have been one of those people on that ship. I was at the right time. But I thought too, the characters that were played were awesome. Not just the actors, but the characters they portrayed. I'll say one thing about Robert Duvall's his deal. He was not afraid, it seemed like, to die. He was walking on there with a cowboy hat on, invincible. Everybody else was diving for cover, and he's just walking around like this is his domain. It was his pleasure to be there. So I was really intrigued by the Robert Duvall character, even though, like you said, he was there, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and he's the guy that stands out in my mind.
Yeah, you're exactly right. They see like an explosion happening like 5 feet away from him. He's just amazed. I think Willard says something to the effect of, "This guy won't die here, right? He's just blessed by the fate or God or whatever, that he won't die."
One part in that scene of the flight of the Valkyries and their landing on the beach in the village that really got me, and it really just brought me to tears, was the boy that was saying, "I'm not getting off, I'm not getting off," and they just pulled him off. Right. And that just wrecked me. I was like, wow.
Yes.
And Bill, I also had a question. Did your peers at the time that this was going on, did they recognize the gravity of the war and of the situation, or was it until after that everyone really kind of understood it better?
No, I believe that they did feel the gravity of it. I believe that we, as young people at the time, in our 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, yes, we did know. It was like the first war that was ever covered. I think that, people would be there and you would see film of action going on, and we saw it on our TVs. And so it was a topic of conversation. It was certainly a dread. Hey, when I got my number, my draft number, fear came through me because I knew what the people ahead of me, my friends that were older than me, were coming back in body bags and coming back in wheelchairs. So it was real. I'm glad you said that because it was definitely real. And it was a topic. It was a topic of conversation every day.
Yeah, the famous instance is the Tet Offensive, right? You remember the Tet Offensive? Like historians often claim that's when America lost the war because they lost the war in the public's mind because the media
Yes.
covered it so extensively and public's.
And two, that public's eye, it overflowed into harsh feelings toward the soldiers when they came home. I mean, it was terrible. It was just, you wouldn't think that. You know, we saw in this movie as these guys were on this gunship and they were firing these big guns toward the shoreline. They didn't know what they were hitting. They had to shoot though. Remember one other time there was a woman, I can't remember what scene it was. She comes over and they yell, she's got a grenade.
Mhm.
And this young woman had brought this grenade over. Of course, they kill her out from the helicopter, but yet they did not know who their enemy was. The enemy they were fighting looked just like the South Vietnamese. So it was a war that could not be won.
One of the gut-wrenching scenes is when they're in the gunship and they kill the woman thinking she's going to murder them, and she's just covering up a puppy. Right. That's one of the hard scenes to watch here.
My mind was so back and forth this entire movie about that. Anytime Vietnam is mentioned, I always think of the people who killed innocent Vietnamese people, and then I also think of the Viet Cong who were in those villages who were also killing Americans. It's such a messy situation. There's no black and white to it.
Oh, I agree. And as I was watching it, I encountered that feeling of almost anger at the soldiers. And I was examining that feeling myself. And I was like, at the time that this was happening, these young men who were sent to fight weren't to blame for that. They're soldiers following orders. And the crimes that were committed really fall at the feet of the American military, of the higher ups of the government, for not informing them better and for not giving them the tools they needed to successfully go in there and honorably fight.
Right. Yeah, at its heart.
You're muted, Bill.
Also to remember, yeah, I do that. So they try to mute me here at the house a lot. That's I heard you. And here's another thing. We're on their turf. As we go up this river, we're seeing their turf. It's crazy. It's all plants. It's vegetation everywhere. We don't know about all this, but they do. They live there. That's their domain. Why would we fight a war like that? Politically, I think there's a lot of political thoughts that can come into this movie. I know I thought about it a lot. We could have fought this war definitely a different way. We go into Desert Storm and we go over there, we fight that war almost perfectly. We lose very few people comparatively. We go into Vietnam and lose 56,000 people. That's crazy. It was a war that we didn't want to win, I don't believe.
Yeah, at its heart, that's one of this movie's main themes, right? How do you beat these people, right? How do you do it? Right? They're so entrenched. Well, it's their home, like you said, Bill, right? It's their home. They're so entrenched in their worldviews. Why the question of why we're there in the first place, that comes up, right? But how do you win? How do you win against the people who will just keep coming back over and over? The traditional rules of warfare no longer apply, right? This is a complete insurgency war, right? So how do you win? Like Colonel Kurtz, that's what his character is all about, right? He has this answer, right? He's the only one that seems to have some kind of inkling how you even do it, right? You have to. He kind of like gets into the hearts and minds of the people, right? He makes them fear. He makes them fear him, right? And that's how. And he seen like the whole when we get to the end of the hellish place, they see these bodies hanging everywhere, right? That's how Kurt seems to think that you're gonna win. You can ask yourself, is he really? This is another movie where you can kind of ask the question: is the antagonist really the antagonist, right? Or is he actually the only one who knows really what's going on, right? His character is so interesting through the movie. Right? We learn that he's this very educated man, right? I think it says in the movie he went to Harvard for his master's degree. He went to West Point, close to the top of his class. He wanted to become a general, or they wanted him to become a general, but he stayed a colonel because he wanted to be in the front lines. Yeah, so why? That's the whole point of the movie. The government wants to kill this guy, right? Because he's kind of lost his marbles. It seems, but has he?
A rogue.
Right? Has he really? I don't know. You guys have any?
Doesn't he go into? He goes into special forces in his middle 30s or something, which was unheard of. I know that Willard, Captain Willard makes the statement, said, I barely made it through at 19 and 20, and he's going through it at 35. So he was maybe a man before his time. So I don't know. I think that he was one of those people that saw it wasn't working, and he could have been a general, and yet he chooses to go the other direction. He is a fabulous character here for sure.
Oh yeah, I agree with everything you said, Bill. And one thing that I thought, hearing his backstory about how he went into the Air Force, like a few years into his initial service, and avoided being a general at all costs. And when I thought about that, I thought, well, the generals are people who like give orders, correct, and that are a little bit higher up and have more of a command. Well, what I thought about that was him trying to avoid the responsibility for the actions that these soldiers are committing at the hands of the generals and of the higher ups. Because people who are simply pawns, which some would argue soldiers are in most instances, don't have to hold the responsibility of choosing those actions. They're simply carrying out orders.
I agree, Nicole. I always also see him as someone who is there to fight the fight instead of being the brass, so to speak. Um, he's there to be in the trenches with you, and I believe that he had a lot of the right ideas whenever it did come to that. I believe that he could have been a game changer, and there's several more out there. Obviously, he wasn't the only one, but as in like whenever they sent the one guy up there and he ended up joining him, how he just blew that one reporter's mind. Like anything that he said, he was just like, whoa, man, this is crazy. Like, um, he, I liked him a lot, and I hated that it had to be like it was, but he knew that he wanted his story told. He didn't want the story told how the army or the Navy or anybody was going to tell it. He wanted him to tell his son the real story, and he wanted to die like a man with his people. And that says something about his character as well.
On that note, another thing that really stood out to me were his people and who they were. They weren't only Americans, they were everyone. And it really stood out to me immensely that he made that choice, because, you know, I couldn't imagine being in a war. I've not lived through one that is very relevant in my mind. I've not been close to an experience like that. But I'm sure that the soldiers in that situation did not look at the people they were fighting against, or even the citizens, and think those are my people. You know, they were forced in a way to view them all as the enemy, because, you know, you very couldn't identify them very well. And instead of looking at them and seeing the enemy, he saw his people, just people, and then they became his people.
Mm.
So you think that's how Kurtz gets the natives, so to speak, on his side, by getting into their hearts and minds as well? That's kind of what you're saying here.
Yeah, and I also think that what he said about judgment is very important, because I feel like we as Americans and as people who live in a very I'm trying to think of the word, a very, not industrialized, but like a very progressive society, we can view people who live in a bit more of a tribal way, and we can judge them for that, and we can make assumptions about them, when just because their way of life isn't as complex and complicated as ours doesn't mean it has less value.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Like I said, even the original book had this subtext behind it, but this is this colonial type of subtext, right? The idea that we have to bring our culture to these types of people, right? Because our culture is superior, or what have you, right? So viewing these other people as others, right? Others in quotation marks, right, is different. You know, this is a, as far as this is a thing that's really common like in British lit, right? Because the British conquered so many different people, right? They conquered India, right? Africa. So especially if you're a reader, this kind of theme is very prominent. But it's that way with Vietnam, right? That's kind of like maybe how we viewed them.
You know, we read commentary on anything, whether it be about politics, religion, or even countries, and we have to be careful of what we read and who we read after, or we'll believe a lie and be in the wrong position. I read several things that I was not sure of. One, for instance, when they were sacrificing the cow, that was a real sacrifice that he chose to film. Is that probably correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
And I thought about how that would be in contrast to how we operate religiously. We're not going to kill an animal and sacrifice, and yet, you know, we have a tendency to bring our ways on other people when maybe we're out of line when we do that, you know. And there was a lot of things. I think I read too where it was Robert Duvall, or not Robert Duvall, but Martin Sheen had a heart attack during this particular filming. I just thought too that the variety of actors in this. I mean, all of a sudden you get to this place that we're traveling toward, and Dennis Hopper, of all people, comes through with 7 cameras on his body. I mean, Dennis Hopper is one of my favorite actors. He's one of those guys that I kind of like. And that just floored me seeing him. And I thought that was a weird character though. Why was he still with all these cameras and all this modern and still living? His head wasn't floating around in the water or up on the bank. What was his? Did anybody have anything on this guy? What was your take on Dennis Hopper's character?
You know,
Maybe he let him live so that he could have his story told, and told in the proper manner, and let people actually see what's going on over there, not what has been screened or, um, only viewed how others want them to see it. He wanted them to see the real war, what had really been going on. That's my opinion.
I agree with you, Crystal. That's something that I noticed. And another thing that came to my mind was, as you were saying, or as we were talking about, the tendency that we have to enforce our beliefs and our cultures on other people. I wondered if when he came in, he did not have that mindset and he didn't have that bit of condescendence in himself. He came to observe, to capture, to experience, and not to inflict in any way.
Right? He's almost I think that's what, to answer your question, Bill, about that character. I think that's one reason why that Time magazine scene that I told you was added into Redux is so important, because Marlon Brando reads to Willard, right, or Kurtz reads to Willard, right? This journalism, right? It's very idealized journalism. It's blatantly false, right? So it's almost like we have a fake news type of theme here, right? As far as the real war versus the ideal war that's painted on to the public.
And I think,
Go ahead.
well, I think we did. I think we did have fake news. I believe that we, as the American people, during that time, we saw what the government wanted us to see, and so it was, even our character, Captain Willard, he's coming up this boat. He's learning about his goal or his adversary as he goes up. So as he's reading, we're learning who this Walter Kurtz is. We're learning as we go along. And I think what he was reading and what he was experiencing was changing his mind about this Colonel Kurtz. If he would have listened to the generals totally, just only, and the people that were getting him command to go up the river and get him, he would have been really, he didn't get all the information. He learned about who this guy was.
You can watch old videos of, or I can watch old videos like we've established before. Bill, you're the only one who's lived through this experience. But I've seen old videos of like right at the height of Vietnam, you were having some people starting to question it, and you would have their parents being like, "No, the government knows what's best for us. The government is trusting of us." And I really feel like Vietnam was the first time that we as a people started to question what our government was doing, starting not to just blindly follow what they were talking about.
That is a great point, Corey, because we really didn't question Korea like we did Vietnam.
And I think that skepticism that the American people gained in that time is really such an important quality and such an important trait. Because if you look at countries that have had dictators and that have had, tyrannical governments and things like that, if their citizens had been a bit more skeptical in the beginnings of those when they were taking root, and maybe if they would have not taken everything for word and not taken everything as fact, maybe things wouldn't have turned out that way for them. And I think it is so important for everyone in the world, really, to maintain a bit of skepticism, because it can keep us from being fooled and it can keep us from believing falsities.
It's a healthy bit of skepticism is always important, and you always need to. Uh, this is gonna sound like I'm making a point, but it's not. You don't. You want to be sure not to be totally gullible, but you want to be sure not to be totally skeptical, because then you're just gullible in the exact opposite sense.
Right. Yeah, that leaves you susceptible to like somebody like Kurtz, right, who's going to inflict their worldview, right? So it goes to show that there's two different sides to the evil here, right? We have the government side and we have the Kurt side in the movie, right? Who's worse? I guess that's a question we could maybe pose.
I was going to ask this really quick. One scene or one part of a scene that stood out to me and made me really think was during the flight of the Valkyries, after all of this destruction, when they're finally past the conflict, and you have the man with the bullhorn saying, "We are here to help. We are here to help." That made me stop and think, I wonder if those citizens really felt that. I wonder if the people of Korea who were not Viet Cong and who were not involved in the conflict and were simply swept up in it due to living there, did they understand that? And did they see Americans as really there to help? You know, did they understand? Or were we even really there to help?
What were we helping? What was our mission? If we were helping, what were we doing? Liberating people that didn't know they were really in bondage. We were fighting a war against communism so it wouldn't spread, and yet we fought it in a way that was almost inhumane. Look at Agent Orange. Look at some of those bombs that we were able to drop, and where it would just, I mean, just absolutely fire would go everywhere. I mean, no wonder if we go back and we go to the first scene and we see Captain Willard in that motel room, who's that guy? Where had he been? He had seen enough already. There was a during this period of time, one of the warfares was to send a man out, and he may go out for weeks at a time and just search the jungles out there alone, all by himself. And then he would come back and give reports. What kind of mental stress would this be? I guess it was enough to replace your canteen's water with whiskey. And I got a lot from that. This man needed something more than water to sustain his mental capabilities. It was an ugly, ugly time in our history for sure.
Well,
That's
you see that he talked about his family. Like whenever he was with his family, all he could think about was there. It just got to the point where he didn't care about anything else. And we see, I mean, Dad and I anyway, we know of people who have been over there and what psychological damage that it done. I mean, we had one guy that was an amazing guy, finally just couldn't take it anymore and drives head on to oncoming traffic on corridor G. I mean, you see what kind of turmoil that done even that many years later. I mean, it was probably 20, 30 years later whenever that happened. So all that time, that's something that he dealt with and lived with every day. So what we have been told and we've seen that went on over there probably doesn't hold a candle to what really happened over there and what our soldiers really seen and what those poor Vietnamese really seen.
yeah. I'm glad you brought that scene up, Bill. This is a good time to even talk about film. I'd even more than story, but even film. That first scene of this movie is iconic. You get the view of the lush landscape of Vietnam, right? Then the Doors music hits, right? This is the end. And then the napalm blowing it all to smithereens, right? Then the editing tricks with the helicopter blades and the ceiling fan, right? That was another cool trick that Coppola did here. Um, yeah, it's good. It's a good time to talk about the soundtrack in the movie. You guys have talked about Valkyries. What'd you make of the Doors? All the Doors music in this. There's a lot of other music too. The Rolling Stones have "Can't Get No Satisfactions" in here. Um, Susie Q. They play that during the one of the Playboy Bunny scenes. Right? What'd you guys make of soundtrack in the movie?
Out of all the songs, I'm amazed they didn't play Fortunate Son by CCR.
Mm.
It seems like no matter what, three things that always go together is Vietnam helicopters and Fortunate Son. So I'm surprised that wasn't in there. But to hear Rolling Stones and the Doors, the music of the time, like that's it just like honestly, just like with Fortunate Son, it just kind of goes together with the whole vibe of the place, the whole being in the jungle of Vietnam and all of that. It just kind of suits it well.
I agree, and I think that with all of their choices as far as music goes in this, you know, sound wise, it might sound kind of upbeat, but if you look into the meaning of it, it's a lot darker. Think, as Bill was saying, all of these people, all of these soldiers were mainly young men. And, you take that youthful vibrancy and just that joy and that lust for life, and you darken it. And you honestly, utterly destroy it, because that's what I got from this. Like the choice for music, it made me just relate to it more than I would have if it would have been other music, I feel.
I thought it was interesting that in the very beginning of the movie, it was playing a song about the end. I thought that was funny. Well, more ironic.
Yeah, that's the name of the song, "The End" by the Doors. Or yeah,
Well, this was the music of that time as well, but it's been something. These songs and these artists have been iconic through time. You guys are a lot younger than us, so and you still know those songs. If you don't, at least those bands or those artists. And I believe that has a lot of impact, because the music then really described what life was like in America at that time. When you've got that kind of hippie, vibey feel, but yet there's like a heaviness to that as well. And I feel like that was portrayed in the music.
Not really on the note of music, but one thing that I noticed throughout the film was the theme of drugs, of drug use. I mean, throughout the whole thing, you had people smoking weed, and you had the surfer drop a tab of acid and stuff. Was that really prevalent during the war? I mean, were the people over there that were fighting, did they really partake in stuff like that?
I think the answer to that is yes.
yeah.
Um, and and not only did they do it there, they brought it home. Those that came back brought it home. Why? Because they brought it home because they brought the war home with them. The war did not end when they got discharged. The war did not end when they left Saigon. The war had never ended for these guys. Never. It never. If you get a chance to talk to a Vietnam veteran, the last thing he will want to talk about is Vietnam. He probably has never probably talked to his family about it. And the drugs were more prevalent, and they did come back. And smoking a joint then was probably more uh, happening more then than it did now. Now we've went on to other different drugs now, but marijuana at the time was the drug of choice because hash and that kind of thing was being introduced to us more and more and more, and a lot of that came back from the war.
And then the
Well,
cold
you
weather.
think about people's reasonings for doing drugs. Usually, it's to escape or to kind of be able to cope with something. And I believe that they had more than they knew what to deal with. And, you know, this was still a time that it wasn't super cool to be depressed or have anxiety or whatever. We were just coming out of those eras where it was so bad, like we have noticed in those other movies. So, I mean, we still wasn't, you know, where we are today. And I believe that was their way of coping or dealing with it. And maybe that's why they did bring it back with them too. Um, I've talked to several Vietnam vets, and that's just what you done. I mean, I think that their life was so tragic and dark that that was their way to escape, whether it be drinking or smoking a joint or dropping a hit of acid. Although I don't know that I'd want to drop a hit of acid over there, especially if it's a bad one, and then you're screwed then, because we seen how it affected him the rest of the movie, didn't we?
Yeah, going in enemy territory, dropping acid, that doesn't seem like the best idea. Especially if you're on a river, an unstable river, and you got trees around you. It's not good. Don't do it.
Remember the scene with the cook, right? He goes crazy over the tiger, right? He's tripping acid while the tiger while the tiger tries to get him. So
And plus, y'all got to think about the time period too. It's in the 70s, and here it's Woodstock and everything else going on.
It's the sex, drugs, and rock and roll time.
Yeah.
And that scene where they were at the bridge and those people there were just in a kind of mania. Honestly, I thought to myself, are they on crack? I was like, have they gained access to that? And has that, taken a part in their descent into madness? Because that's what I saw there. Complete madness.
Are you talking about the scene right before they go into Cambodia? Like
the one where the surfer just says that he dropped acid and then gets off with the captain and goes looking for gas, and they come back with mail.
Yeah. That's a very haunting scene in the movie, right? Because there you see these guys, like, it is very drug-like, like very like LSD type of feel. But you see these guys fighting and they don't even know what they're shooting at. They don't know what they're fighting for. They even say there's no commanding officer there. Right. So that's a very haunting scene in the movie, I think.
Every scene that takes place at night, I feel that same way. It's just you don't see anything, your anxiety just skyrockets, and it's just insane. Like that scene in particular, and a couple other scenes where all the light you see is fire, like fire on what looks like tiki torches, or the lights from the bridges and stuff. Like, it's just, like I said, it's anxiety inducing.
Yeah, that's an interesting scene too, because that is right before they cross that threshold into Kurtz's territory, right? So this point of no return almost.
We should think about the age of these soldiers that were over there as well. I mean, I know we touched on it a little bit, but like on the boat, whenever I forget his name, the black guy was laying there and his mother's letter was being read out loud. Like that was really crushing to me because these were kids. I mean, could you imagine? I mean, that's like, you know, Corey, you can't be very old, not to me. So it has to be like, your age being out there and you would be over, this platoon or whatever because of your age. And you had younger guys underneath you. I mean, you got to think about the mentality. You you've barely started living your life and you see all this death and destruction.
Yep.
It's just so sad to me, and I carried that kind of heavy feeling through the movie. Even whenever you hear Charlie Sheen's dad, Mark, you hear him reading about this guy and all this stuff that he's accomplished. This great man, and yet he still wasn't an old man. He was still a fairly young man. I mean, I'm going to say that because I'm in my 40s. So he was still a fairly young man and he'd accomplished all of this stuff. So we had very young people over there, even as high as the big brass.
That didn't really fully settle into my mind until the same scene you were talking about. But strangely, it wasn't when that one fella died. It was when the surfer who had been on the gun, he gets up and he goes, "Where's the dog? Where's the dog?" Mm. And like thinking of myself personally, I'm an animal lover. Having something like that with me in that much chaos and that much death would have been a real comfort. And him just losing that, it's like their youth was ripped away from them and their innocence was ripped away from them.
Yeah, and to go and even to speak on your point when you called me out for my age, uh, I'm just 22 and I don't feel like I've started life at all. Like I'm gonna be a history teacher. I haven't even started my career yet, and to think that I would be like the senior among like that platoon or those guys in that boat would like like you said, everybody there is just a kid. Everybody except for Martin Sheen, just because I don't know how old he is at the time. And that scene, like it was when he died, that it kind of my heart sank, and you just see Chief just looking at the camera that's supposed to be the players saying the rest of everything, and at one point she says, "Come back in one piece because we need you here. Your daughter needs you here, or we need your wife needs you here so you can make me grandchildren." It's it kind of speaks to the horror of Vietnam in general. This has been a heavy movie, honestly.
Yeah, it's definitely the heaviest movie we've watched. Probably will watch.
And that word came from that era. It's heavy. You know, that I remember that being said many times. It was a very hard movie for me to. I liked the movie. I thought it was a good movie, but it definitely brought back memories of those memoirs I read from my friend. Toward the end of the movie, he's killed the Marlon Brando's character, Mr. Kurtz. He's killed him and he's coming out, and then when he drops his weapon, all the natives and the other people drop theirs. And remember what he does. He grabs his soldier that came with him and he goes to the boat. I thought that was the only guy that made it other than Martin Sheen was the guy that was on acid. You know, he made it out. I suppose he did. I mean, they're in the boat. He made at least to the boat. Um, I'm a little bit intrigued by the ending of the movie. Crystal and I, we talked about it, and we were wondering, as they were leaving, um, it looked like ashes falling from the sky in the last scene there. I don't know what the ending represents. Um, did did he ever call for them to come and wipe those people out? I don't know. Has anybody got any thoughts on that?
Not to mention, we have our famous last words in the ending too, right? The horror, the horror, the horror, right? You guys have probably heard that at some point too. That's in this movie. Yeah, what you guys make of the ending? Bill, I thought it was cool what you brought up, that it's the acid guy who makes it. I never thought of that before, but it is really neat that the guy who screams over the tiger right when the journey starts, right? He's the only one that makes it. I never. That's a good point. I never thought of that.
Even though he had to be taken by the hand to know it's time to go.
Yeah.
But you know, he had his weapon too, and he set his down in line with everyone else. So at this time, like, my question is, do these people even know who to follow? Because they was following this guy, and then once he gets murdered, then okay, well, we're going to follow you. Whatever you say, that's what we're going to do. So um I don't know. I thought it was sad though that whenever they hollered on the radio almighty to the street gang, and they kept yelling for him, and they didn't respond, and then that's whenever they leveled the place, obviously, because you see the fire and the smoke and you watch the ash fall. That was, it's the reason that he didn't respond back is because he didn't know if that was the right thing to do or the right mission. Um, I don't know. I have a lot of feelings about the ending, actually, but I thought it was a great movie, and I thought the ending was very appropriate.
What I thought when I saw, everyone laying their weapons down, and just the thought that occurred to me about the whole war in general, it doesn't matter who raised their weapon first. All that matters is who puts it down first. And that's what I thought of.
Yeah, and something to add to this that I would add would be like, Martin Sheen's character, he becomes Kurtz almost at the end, right? They sacrifice Kurtz, and it's almost like a new Kurtz is reborn because he's got, if you notice, like his face is all covered in grime. He's got that kind of like crazed look in his eye, right? So it's almost like they're just replacing one Kurtz with another. That's one reason why they all kind of kneel and all of that.
For a second, I thought that's what the ending of the movie was going to be, that he was going to stay there and they were going to have to get another person to go on a classified mission to kill him.
That's what I thought. I thought that very thing too. Talking about the face and the, I guess the makeup was makeup, but his face reminded me, and certainly two totally different movies, was It's a Wonderful Life. when he's lost his mind, and they show that there's a camera scene where it's just his face. I think it was Jimmy Stewart.
Mm-hmm.
And there's his face, and he's got this crazed look on his face. And I thought about that when I saw Martin Sheen's face on this film. It was a very it was a good tactic, I thought, to use with the camera there.
Yeah, Nicole, you said you're an animal lover. What do you think now that they really carved up that cow at the end?
I feel that I personally am glad I wasn't really there, but I don't understand the cultural significance that had to those people, and I don't feel that I have enough knowledge to judge them for that.
A lot of people criticize Coppola for putting that scene in there because it's one of those kind of classic cases, like, why not stop it or something like that, right? So
I think that one thing that we as mainstream, we who live in a mainstream society and in a very first world, need to understand that, especially with animal sacrifices and things like that, those people are paying respect to that animal. Nothing goes to waste. Nothing is looked over. Nothing is unappreciated. And even though we might see it as barbaric and cruel, to them it's their way of life. We have grown so disconnected to our food industry. Back in the day, family living on a farm, they would butcher their own cows. They were there through that animal's whole life, and they obviously would have grown attached to it in some way, and they're going to do everything they can to make the end of its life not painful and make it significant in some way. And we don't have that here. We don't know where our food comes from or what happens to it. All we know is that it's on the table.
Yeah, it's interesting that the cow was what's used to show the murder of Kurtz too. Right, we don't really see him getting stabbed and all this stuff. Right, that's how. Yeah, he's the cow almost.
I knew that was definitely the reason why they showed it, was that you can show a cow getting butchered up, you can't really show a person getting butchered up. And I knew there had to be some sort of parallels about him being a sacrifice. I just wasn't in the mood to think too deeply about it. But it just, I was hoping that it was a puppet or something that they were doing that too. but it looked awfully real. So I kind of figured, because I'm the same way. Like I'm I'm willing to see like somebody who hunted and being like, oh frig, that's a huge buck. I'm proud of you for getting that buck. But could I shoot one? No way. Because I'm just that same way. It's like looking at that cow with just it's rough. It was rough.
I feel that they added that scene in there not only to convey that Kurtz was a sacrifice, but also for the shock value. If this movie wasn't enough to shock you and to make you feel horrified, then let's slap this on your face. Because again, that's something the American people aren't familiar with today. Well, they aren't familiar with any longer.
Yeah, just sitting here now reflecting on our first few weeks of class, it's kind of crazy the great movies we've watched so far, right? This, Cuckoo's Nest, both are classic 70s movies, right? Even our 40s movies. So the artistry that you guys got in those first 5 movies is enough for a whole class almost. We could spend a whole other class talking about this movie, right? There's just so
Yes.
much to it.
One thing off topic I meant to ask, when we were talking about Casablanca, you mentioned the lighthouse. Do you think you'll ever include that in your list, or was it a contender to be on the list this semester?
Yeah, for some reason or other, the thought didn't cross my mind to put it on there. Right, I think I will in the future. Yeah, it is a really great film.
If it's anything like The Witch, it's good. I watched The Witch in theaters, and the use of sound in that movie, I could write 3 pages on. I love it. It's
So
very much like you get a little bit of sound and it just grows and it gets louder and louder and louder. And how some people or how some movies have the jump scare where it's a loud noise after silence. This, to me, the jump scare is the silence that happens after. It's like you get the shock of just like complete silence after that. And they use it like 3 or 4 different times in the movie. It's beautiful.
Another thing, kind of off subject, I read your announcement about switching the movies.
mhm.
So I want to make sure that I'm watching the right movie next.
Yeah, I was going to really quickly say that there was originally The Big Sleep this week. I want to push that back the next Tuesday. Instead, we're going to do Double Indemnity, just start our film noir section. So Double Indemnity is what we're doing for Thursday.
How do you spell the last word of that?
IMDEMNITY, I think. Double Indemnity. So let me just give you briefly, film noir. I'm not going to go way more in depth Thursday, of course, but film noir is the classic detective, almost like detective and gangster film genre. It's very prominent from the 30s through the 50s, right? It's almost like the Western, and then it's kind of died off, but it's kind of grown into other things, as we'll see through this rest of this class. But we've already kind of Casablanca is sometimes referred to as a noir. They're filmed in black and white, right? It's very heavily influenced by German expressionism. So you'll see like lots of shadows and things like that. Double Indemnity, we're doing that one first because it does the tropes of the genre very well, I think. So that's why we're going to do that one first. It'll give us a nice introduction to the genre. It's probably my favorite genre of this class. I love noir films. So very much a different movie than Apocalypse Now, right? You can't really compare anything to Apocalypse Now. So yeah, we're going to finally start diving into genres, right? So we're going to get our first major genre, noir. We're going to do Double Indemnity, The Big Sleep, Chinatown, and then The Untouchables. So those are going to be our 4 noirish type films we watch. Blade Runner is a sci-fi movie, but as we will see, it's also very noir later in the class too. So what I'll do is I'll get your questions up. I'm gonna rewatch the movie tonight. I'll get the questions up tomorrow. But also I'll post some videos too, like introduction to film noir. It goes over the tropes and all that. We'll talk about that on Thursday too. So I'll post some videos in addition to the questions for you. It'll be a good one. This is a great movie. You guys will love it. All right.
Thanks for the discussion, y'all.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.